Today on episode number 357 of the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast, Sandie Morgan and Warren Doody join me to talk about Elizabeth Leonard, an interdisciplinary legacy.
Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential.
Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. I'm Bonni, and this is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to improve our productivity approaches so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. Today, I am joined by two friends and colleagues, Sandie Morgan, who's the director of Vanguard's Global Center for Women and Justice. She's also an interdisciplinary thinker and professor in her own right, as you'll hear about in this episode, and a dear friend. I'm also joined by Warren Doody, who's an associate dean, an English professor and chair, a playwright and author, and so many more things, as you'll start to recognize as you hear their stories and also the story of our former colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Leonard. You'll start to see there's a lot of interdisciplinary stuff happening in their work. Today is an episode that I've been planning for years now, and as will probably become quite obvious, I have shied away from it. It's a very vulnerable topic for all three of us, a hard story for us to tell, but one that we each want to share with you today because of the way the person we're going to share about has impacted us in our lives, and not just our lives, countless number of lives. And Sandie, Warren, and I are excited, and I would say on my part a little reluctant, but knowing how important that this episode might be for touching even more lives in the world, we know how important it is to share with you today about Dr. Elizabeth Dermody Leonard.
This email went out to the entire Vanguard University community. Dear Vanguard community, it is with a heavy heart that I inform you that beloved Vanguard professor, Dr. Elizabeth Dermody Leonard, passed away on Sunday, May 18th in Ireland, her home since retiring from Vanguard.
Elizabeth taught at Vanguard University as a full-time faculty member in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology, serving as an assistant professor of sociology from 1997 to 2002, and then as associate professor of sociology from 2002 to 2007, and finally as professor of sociology from 2007 to 2011. She delivered and expanded the sociology curriculum to include areas of specialization in gender and crime, the sociology of women, corrections, family violence, and juvenile delinquency, and played an integral role in helping grow the sociology major to 100 majors.
Elizabeth sustained a robust research agenda during her tenure at Vanguard University, producing a book, Convicted Survivors, The Imprisonment of Battered Women Who Kill, State University of New York Press, 2002, 4 book chapters, and 9 articles in peer-reviewed journals. She was widely recognized as an expert on issues related to battered women in prison and domestic violence, and as such was invited to present research, guest lecture, provide expert witness testimony, and give various public presentations on 70 different occasions, and in diverse institutional settings and locales in the United States and Europe.
She served Vanguard University faithfully by being a tireless leader and advocate of interdisciplinary collaboration, which included serving as the co-director of Vanguard University's Center for Women's Studies from 2002 to 2005. She advised, counseled, and mentored countless numbers of students who, upon graduating from Vanguard University, followed her example by pursuing vocations that advance the public good.
Elizabeth was highly respected, admired, and regarded by the students at Vanguard University, who voted her the Faculty Member of the Year for 1999-2000 and again as Faculty Member of the Year for 2006, 2007. Over the years, students have consistently expressed their affection for her and their appreciation of her guidance and support.
Upon her retirement, Dr. Leonard was granted the status of Faculty Emerita. Dr. Leonard was a devoted colleague and friend and will be greatly missed. That email was sent on Monday, May 19th, 2014 at 2:04 p.m., and Dr. Leonard has been missed ever since. Each one of us is going to share a little bit about our early memories of Elizabeth.
I still remember the day I met Dr. Leonard. I was referred to her by the president of the university at that time. I was just visiting Vanguard on my way home. I lived in Greece at the time, and the president had a little bit of an understanding of what I was going through as the mother of a daughter in a domestic violence situation. And he said, "You need to meet Dr. Elizabeth Leonard." So I went over to her office. She wasn't there. I left a note and went back to prepare to fly out the next morning. I hadn't been home more than a few minutes when Dr. Leonard called me and spent the next 45 minutes learning everything she could so that she could walk with me through what she had great expertise in with family violence. And that was April 2003. And she walked with me, she mentored me, she engaged me and brought me into the academic community, inviting me to become part of some of the research that she was doing. There are so many memories, but I guess, Warren, why don't you tell us some of your memories?
I first met Elizabeth Leonard in 2001, early May. I actually remember the date. It was May 8th, 2001. And it was at the end of our last faculty meeting of the year. And Dr. Leonard wanted to know how I found or how I came up with ideas for writing scripts. I was a playwright at that time. It was in large part the reason that I was hired at Vanguard, because I could write plays and I could teach playwriting. And what I would find out later is that Dr. Leonard had written a dissertation that would become her book, Convicted Survivors, The Imprisonment of Battered Women Who Kill. And she was spending her summers in Ireland at that time and had become friends with a well-known Irish poet named Brendan Keneally. And Brendan had read her book. Well, he'd read the dissertation and then later he read the book. And he thought that it was a story that really needed to be told globally, nationally, but that because of its academic format, it might not reach a wide enough audience. And so his advice to her was that when she got back to the States, she should find a playwright who could take her academic book and transform it into a stage play, because that would make the words and the play, the book was made up of a lot of monologues of the women that she had written the book about. They were women who had killed their abusive partners. And so when she got back to the States, she started asking around. I had just started at Vanguard. I'd been there for a couple of years, and somebody had told her that I was a playwright. And what I found out later, which was curious and really kind of shows the kind of mind she had, as well as the heart she had for the women that she got to know, got to interview, and ultimately wrote her book about. She spent a year watching me covertly, asking about me, interviewing people about me, because she wanted to make sure that I wasn't somebody who was going to take her work and just exploit it. She wanted to make sure she could trust me with the material. And evidently I had enough allies on the campus that at the end of that year, she approached me and she said that, she asked me if I was interested in a project that she was willing to hand over to me. And I said, yes. We walked down to her office and she told me about her research. I didn't really know it at the time. And she told me about these women that she'd gotten to know and that she'd done her dissertation on, and that the book was forthcoming, and wanted to know if I wanted to take that material and turn it into a play. And I said, yes. And I told her right on the spot that I was interested. And she said, you should meet the women. And so she set up about a week later a trip to CIW, which is the prison. And we drove out there. And one of the things that was funny is I remember she was a very aggressive driver. And we must have got out to Chino in 35 minutes at 5:30 in the afternoon on a Monday. And we attended the support group meeting that she went to every other Monday. And the support group actually had a name. It was Convicted Women Against Abuse. And there were not only the 42 women, but there were a number of other women. Women started to become attracted to the support group. And it was basically a place for women who had experienced any kind of domestic abuse to meet and to, provide a kind of therapeutic environment where they could talk about their stories. They could lean on each other. They could talk about the progress or lack thereof, of their various appeals. And I was the only man in there. It was me and maybe 50 women, and they welcomed me with open arms. Elizabeth introduced me to all of them, told me, this is just a week later, that I was going to be writing a play about all of them. I was already committed, but she made sure that I was committed. She committed me to the women who would become characters, in a sense, in the play. And I think the thing that was most affecting to me that night was I had an idea of what a women's prison might be like. And what I experienced had nothing to do with this vision that I had before entering the gates of the prison. It's more like a college campus. The support group was held in a warehouse, this sort of warehouse-like room. And the women were very kind. They were very sensitive. They were very warm. They were melancholy, and most of them were middle-aged. Many of them reminded me of my own mother at the time. And I remember driving home, and I did not say a word on the drive back. And I emailed Elizabeth the next day, and I said, I'm all in. And I started to do the research for the play.
Sandie, I know that you had a chance to visit the same place and spend some time there. And also, you and Warren are not the only ones. Would you talk a little bit about your experience and also the experience of students who were invited to engage in this way?
Well, it didn't take very long before Elizabeth became my mentor. And I learned so much from how she did her research, how she did her work, how she included so many people, like Warren from theater department, from English. And I was really impressed that she was working hard to get a family violence class that was cross-listed between sociology and psychology. She developed it. It was her baby. And I didn't even understand at the beginning that she was mentoring me, teaching me to take over that legacy when she retired and teach that class, which I did for several years. But she wanted it to be cross-listed even in the religion and ministries department. She wanted pastors. She believed that everything should be interdisciplinary, that people experience abuse in the workplace, in the home, in society. And when she was part of developing the women's studies minor, she made sure it reflected that interdisciplinary connectedness. And that pulled together experts from across the campus, like Warren.
I don't have an exact date or even an exact year of when I met Elizabeth. She was a part of my Vanguard experience that I can remember from my early beginnings there. I hesitate to tell the story I'm about to tell because I never want to be disparaging of the place where I work. I really like where I work. It's also frustrating, but I really do like where I work. And it's also gone through changes. I've been there almost 20 years now. So culturally, we have experienced changes. When I came in, it was not the greatest experience. I have a very early memory of us dividing up into groups in a large faculty meeting, and there also were members of our board of directors there for some reason I can't recall, but they had us break up into the different groups, and we were all going to share, and someone was going to dictate what happened, and I happened to be in a group with all men. And of course, they all looked to me, just assuming I was going to be the note taker because, after all, I was a woman. And there were other frustrating things like that. Our institution is from a specific denomination that I didn't know anything about before joining. And there were a lot of cultural differences that it took me a while to get used to. Our students, by the way, we just revamped our first year course around something called community cultural wealth. And one of the things we're teaching them about are what's called doca. And doca are all of the unspoken, hidden curriculum, all the rules that are out there when they come to college, especially as first generation students, that unless we can help to strip away some of those things, they aren't ever going to feel welcome. I didn't always feel welcome at Vanguard. I felt that my own religion, my own religious faith didn't necessarily fit there. I felt insecure. I felt this big divide between those people who had tenure, those of us who did not. And it was something that I both didn't understand and was difficult for me. It was a really difficult transition. And what I can recall about Elizabeth, as well as another former colleague of ours who unfortunately has also passed away, who was in our library, Mary Wilson, is just the way that they introduced me to books and names. And I just remember her helping me see our culture, the doca, with a fresh set of eyes and feel like I belonged there. Perhaps even more because there were some more cultural changes that needed to happen for it to be a more inclusive institution, not just for our students, but also for faculty colleagues.
And she was very intentional about introducing faculty and colleagues and students to people from outside that would bring different perspectives and enlarge our borders so we could see further. And I think we could probably, Warren, start a support group for those of us who rode with her out to the prison. But we would spend all of the time just remembering how those visits changed our hearts and minds and attitudes towards people who were in prison for reasons that we had thought were very black and white. And you have your memories, they were like the age of your mother. And I remember sitting on the floor talking to a woman, and she was interested in learning more about my goals to become a teacher. She said, I was a librarian. And so then a little bit later, when we're going home, Elizabeth told me she had been sentenced to life without parole. And I know those kind of stories really impacted you.
The title of my play, that was an excellent handoff. The title of my play ended up being Life Without Parole. And I was able to take all the, that box of materials and the transcripts of the interviews that Elizabeth conducted with the 42 women who made up this support group. And, when Elizabeth handed off all of this material, she told me, I won't tell you how to write the play. She goes, I'm not going to be a critical voice. I will be a fact checker. And she was the best writing partner ever. She corrected facts. She was my biggest fan. Most of the early productions, she showed up. She supported. We did it with a group of Arizona actors. We did it with students at Vanguard. We went into the prison 3 times and performed in front of the inmates. All 3 performances at CIW were memorable. The first one was the most memorable. That was in January 2004. We arrived early during the day. We did a whole tour of the prison. And then Elizabeth introduced us we performed in front of convicted women against abuse. And one of the inmates had a box of Kleenex, a couple of boxes of Kleenex, and she handed it to a friend of hers. And they walked up and down the rows of the audience, handing out the Kleenex as the reading went on because people were in tears. And then at the very end of the reading, we took questions. We had a Q&A, and one woman stood up right away and said, this is the first time in my life that I haven't felt ashamed of what I did. It really, in so many ways, Elizabeth really changed my life. She changed my life as a creative person, as a playwright, and just really you don't meet that many people like her in life who are so dimensional. She was no doormat. I know Sandie and Bonni will agree with me. She could fight if she had to. She could stand her ground if she had to. But what was so wonderful about her is she always fought the right fight. And yet, at the same time, if you tried to go to her office at Vanguard, you needed to
make a reservation, right?
Weeks in advance. I mean, the line of students went out the door. They went down the hallway and out the door. One last comment about her. When she retired, I asked Ed Clark, who was going to take over as, maybe he was already chair at that point. I asked him about her replacement, and he just looked at me and he goes, we've got a full professor. We've got a domestic violence expert. We've got a published author. We've got an ordained minister. We've got a surrogate mother. And we've got the best person on campus. Won't be hard replacing her at all. Because she was a sort of one-size-fits-all person. She could do so many different things.
Well, and I think that really speaks to her emphasis and commitment to interdisciplinary. She didn't own everything as this is sociology. And she pulled in history and law. And she partnered with the Anaheim Police Department, chief of police. She went with me to do community outreach in Greece and speak at universities. And she also would be happy to go to the business department and marketing. And she had students who followed her that had never intended to study sociology. And I remember when Olivia Klaus began imagining what the play would look like if it became a film. And so she was still a student at Vanguard when that dream was planted and when Elizabeth planted those seeds. So this interdisciplinary piece was huge for her. I've got to tell you one part where she told me when she was teaching me to teach the family violence class and why I couldn't just read sociology books. And I had to read theology and I had to read psychology and all these things. She said, and you have to read history. And she told me, do you know why we say rule of thumb? And I looked at her and I thought, okay, usually I'm hanging on every word, but not right now. But then she began to cite the law in the UK that was passed to limit the size of the stick that a husband could use to beat his wife. And that became rule of thumb. She knew so much from such a broad spectrum of disciplines, and she wanted her students to have that kind of competency as well.
I'll just piggyback real quick, but from an interdisciplinary standpoint, we were able to, especially when the students at Vanguard got involved and we went on the road and produced the play, we had English, we had theater, we had sociology, and even beyond that, Elizabeth, she wrote several articles for the American Sociological Association. And I didn't realize at the time that the kind of play that I wrote had a genre that I'd never heard of, public sociology. So she was still teaching me things all the way up to the end.
One memory that I know Sandie and I share about Elizabeth, although I suspect Warren, you too, is just the way that she would allow any of us to just show up. There was no need to pretend. There was no need to say the fancy words or show up in ways that weren't authentic. We could show up, we could vent, we could be angry. She could hold other people's anger. She could hold other people's fears. She could hold other people's insecurities. I mean, she allowed you to show up just as you were. And I can recall there came a time in any conversation where she would turn it, because just venting, just being angry, just being sad, it loses its possibility. And so she would remind us to persist. She would remind us to keep going, to not give up, that yes, we could spend those moments in sorrow. We could spend the moments in our anger, that those are important feelings. But then she would always have a part in the conversation where she would say, never the less. And that was our reminder that the conversation was about to shift, which for me often came in some uncomfortable ways because it meant things were about to get messy because it was going to be, okay, so now what? Didn't try to tell you not to worry, didn't try to tell you not to be sad, but there were those moments, nevertheless. And her voice still echoes in my head when I feel the rage. We're going through a global pandemic. We're seeing systemic inequities just persist and be magnified. And she would listen to all of that. And she'd be joining us. If she, like you said, Warren, she'd be joining us. And then she would say, nevertheless. Before the three of us get to the recommendations segment and share a few things that we want to recommend to you, I would like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, and that is SaneBox. What SaneBox does is it allows us to deal with the fact that we get so much email, but most of it doesn't need to be read and especially doesn't need to interrupt our days. And what happens is you set SaneBox up. You can use Google, Office 365, iCloud, or any email address. And it looks at the headers of your emails. It doesn't look at the contents, but it sorts those emails into things that you are likely to want to leave in your inbox or things that should go and get tucked away in a folder such as saying later. I should look at that later, not have it clogging up the most pressing items that should be in my inbox, putting it in a folder just for newsletters. And SaneBox does nice sorting. It also addresses email in other ways. I can send an email out to someone I'm expecting a reply from and tell SaneBox, if they haven't replied to me in 3 days, send me a reminder so I can check in with them again. And with all of the things that so many of us are dealing with, that sense of urgency, I do really get so much benefit out of using SaneBox. And if you head over to sanebox.com/TIHE, as in teaching in higher ed, you can get a free trial. Check it out, see if it works for you as well as it's been working for me for years now. You'll also get a $25 credit toward a SaneBox subscription. Again, head on over to sanebox.com/TIHE. This is the time in the show where we each get to share our recommendations. And I wanted to recommend formally the documentary that Sandie mentioned a little while ago, and that's called Sin by Silence. So Elizabeth had Warren write a play, and Elizabeth inspired a student who became an alumni who really transformed a lot of things around these issues as well. And the documentary is called Sin by Silence. And I'm reading the description from the website, which I'll have in the show notes. From behind prison walls, Sin by Silence reveals the lives of extraordinary women who advocate for a future free from domestic violence. And I can recall both watching Warren's play and also watching Sin by Silence. I think Sin by Silence came first because there was someone opened up their home to do a pre-screening, and I remembered not wanting to go, just thinking, oh, what a topic, but of course knowing that I needed to go, and my husband and I went. And one story that hasn't come out yet, it's come out a little bit, but just most people, well, you killed someone. Surely you should deserve to be in prison. That's an easy thought to have until understanding these issues. And I so vividly remember just the imagery from the movie about that there's a little bit more nuance between good and bad, between right and wrong, between who deserves to spend their life in prison. It's a very important piece of work. Warren's play is very important, and Elizabeth's work continues to persist today. Sandie, what do you have to recommend today?
Well, I have two things. First of all, adverse childhood experiences. The research for this was just beginning to be published in the early days when I was working with Elizabeth. And now it is widespread. She would love to know that here in California, we have a website, acesaware.com, because the roots of so many family violence situations are in a history of child abuse and health issues. So ACEs Aware is my tip for you on behalf of Elizabeth. And also, I was thinking that a lot of what Elizabeth planted in me evolved into a very collaborative approach. And now the Center for Women's Studies has grown into the Global Center for Women and Justice. And many of the initiatives that we've started are just continuing the story and the teaching and the study and the research that Elizabeth started. So you can see some of the fruit of what she planted at gcwj.org.
Warren, what do you have to recommend for us today?
My recommendation is not connected to what we talked about today. Well, tangentially connected. I teach a course in the short story. I also write fiction as well as writing plays. And we use two texts in that class. The first one, probably most listeners have heard of. It's called Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. And it's the one that the students favor. And it's really an excellent text on creative writing and how to get started. And not just that, just she covers almost everything, writing groups, jealousy, agents, broccoli. There's a chapter in there on broccoli. I won't give it away. You got to read that one. It's quite riveting. But the other text that I use is by John Gardner, and it's called The Art of Fiction. And John Gardner, he died at the age of 50 in a motorcycle accident. But before he died, he wrote a series of books on how to be a writer. He had, like I said, there was The Art of Fiction. There was one called On Moral Fiction. He felt that all fiction should be moral, ultimately. And on becoming a novelist. But he is pretty much the foremost expert on how to write creatively. I mean, he was so erudite and he was so learned. The students don't always like that one as much. They prefer Anne Lamott, who again is great. But my recommendation is The Art of Fiction. It's really a treasure.
And I want to publicly thank Warren for kind of bringing everything back together again by inviting the Global Center for Women and Justice, something that Elizabeth shaped and helped start, to partner when you produced Life Without Parole a couple of years ago. And I have this amazing poster in my office, and I can write on my CV because Elizabeth taught me to collaborate with my theater friends. And so I'm just having good memories about Elizabeth that are related to the relationships that she brought together.
I am going to give a shout out to Sandie on that same note. We ended up producing the play at the Edgemar in Santa Monica in 2016. We were trying to raise the money to pay the actors, to rent the space and everything else. We tried everything and we kept running into roadblocks. And Sandie and Bonni is the same way. They are people who can get things done. And Sandie said, I'll raise the money. And she did it. And she pulled it off. And we made her a producer on the play. But I don't know if we would have staged it without her. So,
oh my goodness. Well, Elizabeth made us better together.
Yes.
And I'd have never really gotten to know you without Elizabeth. So I'm grateful. Nevertheless,
I'm going to add one more anecdote about Bonni. I don't even know if she remembers it. It's a little embarrassing. I believe it or not, I get a little embarrassed talking about myself, but although you wouldn't see any evidence of that today. I was sitting on the floor in the Heath building and we were waiting for a class to stand. And for some reason, Bonni was sitting right next to me and I introduced myself to her and she looked at me and she goes, oh, you're Elizabeth's friend. And I said, yes. And she goes, you're famous. Which I'm not, but I so appreciated it at that time.
I have no memory of this, but Elizabeth had just the right, as does Sandie, by the way, just the right mix of helping equip people but we never sit around feeling 100% confident. I don't really know that anybody does, but it looks a lot of times when you look at other people in life like they know exactly what they're doing. But I'm just convinced that that's just not true the vast majority of the time. And when you meet people like Elizabeth, they can help you see the ways that you can do things in life that you never would have thought were possible. So I know that she mentored you so much, Sandie. Before I knew it, I meet Sandie later on, and then I'm going to Washington, D.C. to speak at a research institute. What am I doing here? And, I think a lot of us have had that experience that's been transformative from Elizabeth's legacy. And getting to do things, and interdisciplinary work is really messy. And when you get to work with someone else in a field that you don't know anything about, it can really have you feel like, I don't know if I can do this. But she really did that for us, for so many of us.
She knew how to connect people. We're talking about interdisciplinary research and, the ways that research connected with other disciplines, but she knew how to connect people too.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me for today's conversation. I know I invited you many years ago and finally felt like I could do this, and I'm just so glad we could share her story today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Fantastic work. I'm so happy to be a part of this today.
It is wonderful.
It's a hard phase.
I can't imagine a better thing to do than sit around and remember such an amazing influence in all of our lives.
Yeah.
Thanks once again to Sandie Morgan and Warren Doody for joining me for this conversation to celebrate Dr. Elizabeth Leonard. It was Sunday, May 18th in Ireland, 2014 that she passed away. We miss you, Elizabeth. We thank you for all of the work that you did over so many years. And we thank you for the ways in which we can continue living out your legacy, continuing the kinds of work that make a difference in this world for so many. We miss you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Sandie and Warren, for helping me celebrate her, and thanks to all of you for listening. I'll see you next time on Teaching in Higher Ed.